So today is February 2nd, the second day of Black History Month, and the day after Langston Hughes' birthday. And although we're a day late, I thought that I would say something about this particular poem, and there are a number of reasons why, I've chosen theme for English B, and hopefully some of those reasons will come out, in the discussion. So to frame the context of the piece, the synchrony of Langston Hughes' birthday on the first day of Black History Month is, from the perspective of chance, one would say almost an accident, if you believe in chance. But presumably February was chosen as initially in 1969 by Carter G. Woodson, who presumably chose the month of February because in 1864, the Senate, had passed the 13th Amendment, and that was ratified by the House on January 31st, 1865, and signed into law as an amendment to the Constitution on February 1st by Abraham Lincoln in the year 1865. So presumably, Carter Woodson chose February for that reason, and then also, I believe, because both Abraham Lincoln's and Frederick Douglass's birthdays fall sometime in mid-February. But Langston Hughes, certainly by any and all means, belongs to the history of both the civil right, the continuation of the civil rights movement in the United States, because obviously it didn't begin in the 1960s as it is sometimes framed, and to the history of Black culture in the United States as well, obviously, this year's theme, quite understandably, for African American History Month, Black History Month in the United States, is African American health and wellness, which is understandable, given our situation in relationship to the human destruction wrought by COVID-19, and also wrought by false claims made on the part of media and other institutions that are devoted to capitalizing for profit on any event, any object, any resource available, and I'm referring to obviously all of the wealth that, in particular, Jeff Bezos and Amazon.com has acquired since the outset of COVID-19, increasing the value of his business from $200 billion to $240 billion over the course of what was hardly more than a year. And doing so largely at the expense and cost of his workers' health, and in many instances of his workers' lives. And all the while, pushing very aggressively against attempts to unionize. And of course, those attempts to unionize in part are the consequence of concerns over workers' health and well-being. So there's many reasons to focus this particular year's theme for Black History Month on health and well-being. But and what follows isn't a criticism of that, but merely an addendum. I think there's also very good reason to focus this year's Black History Month on the theme of education and in particular censorship in America, and how that relates. The challenge of acquiring literacy as an African American has always been a central feature and theme in African American literature. It's one of the central motifs in the autobiography of the life of Frederick Douglass, as well as in various slave narratives and other early literary works by African American men and women. And the theme of literacy is a big part of Hugh's work as well. It's not just here in this particular poem, but obviously it is here in this particular poem. So I like the idea of beginning here with this theme, and we'll see the way in which the theme of health, even though it's not explicit in this particular work of Hugh's, is there in an underlying and subtle way as well. So I was going to say, we've just seen the censorship of, Spiegelman's Mouse, and today or yesterday in the news, there was an article about something that Whoopi Goldberg had said regarding the Holocaust and her misunderstanding of the way that Jews were racialized under the Nazis in Germany and under other fascist governments as well. And I don't know if it's a necessary requirement for fascists to be racist, but it seems to be part and parcel to that particular ideology. And if you've studied, the history of fascist propaganda, you'll realize that, and you'll be aware, and in a way, it's hard to understand, how, Whoopi Goldberg didn't understand this, but the Holocaust was always informed by an ideology of racial separation, discrimination, apartheid, and a policy of extermination. And I remember growing up in the 70s and learning this even, as a child. I mean, it was part of the series that we watched called, and I don't remember who the network was that produced these for television, but the World at War focused on a lot of different aspects. I believe of both World War I and World War II, but I may be wrong, but certainly of World War II, and certainly the themes of the Holocaust were part of that. And we, that was a really early introduction. And then, of course, an understanding of the connection between the way that racialization played itself out in World War II and the way that it has played itself out here in the United States, both as the dominant justification for the oppression of Native Americans and the ideological justification for the enslavement of African people here in the United States, was reinforced by series, that came out around the same time, like Roots, like Alex Haley's Roots. And, I don't really know how anyone would miss that connection, but I think that part of the way that we miss that connection is because of censorship, right? So that's my dog sneezing in the background. For whatever reason, Whoopi Goldberg obviously didn't read Mouse, which I didn't either, but I've read a lot of other examples of Holocaust, literature, and did a unit plan, on the Holocaust while I was at, Teachers College that included extensive research, and but in part, one has to blame, I think, the ignorance there with censorship. And so censorship is responsible for the ignorance, and then the ignorance leads to a statement like the one made by Whoopi Goldberg, and then what happens, her network has censored her. So this is an example of censorship in America, which is, one of our playlists on the YouTube channel, and I haven't really discussed it all that much conversationally, but I think I want to discuss it today, and I'll probably discuss some of it in relationship to this poem as it comes up. But it doesn't seem to me that censoring Whoopi Goldberg is really the solution to addressing the ignorance. The solution is to buy copies of Mouse and and to find a way, to distribute, them, and to find a way of buying copies, that don't involve purchasing them from Amazon.com, or other institutions that contribute to our lack of well-being and our health, our both our emotional health here in the United States, our access to truthful and valid information, and that don't contribute to the the death and health harm of our fellow Americans, our ununionized working class Americans. And I'm sure that there are ways of doing that, so we may return to the theme of censorship in relationship to Mouse, and I want to investigate, what what venues, are available for that. There's also a list that's come out, and it's really disturbing. But the Republicans in the Senate are now, trying to censor and ban, anything that that doesn't agree with a particular ideology, and that ideology, has to do with its what's called, pro-life, which is really anti-woman, ideology of misogyny, and the Supreme Court is now attempting to do away with Roe versus Wade. So anything that has to do with women's health issues and rights is on this banned book list, as well as an awful lot of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual literature, and lifestyle literature on this list, as well as a lot of African American volumes, and like I said, pretty much anything that doesn't support like a very frighteningly Nazi-like, sort of white agenda, and of course, Trump is increasing the volume on his racialization of America, and with the new voting restrictions in produced by many swing states, it's becoming frighteningly apparent that our country is following this road of and path of authoritarianism that some of us have been warning about for quite some time. So all of that is going on, and it seems relevant to address all of those issues together, health issues and the way that the destruction of individuals' lives are made possible by industries, venues, and institutions, not only Amazon.com, but elsewhere as well, and the way that the lack of equity and job opportunities in living quality of life situations, in not only education but in access to other types of resources, contributes to the lack of health equity, and the lack of health care available for, in particular for communities that are in other ways economically marginalized or suppressed by institutional racism, and other examples of institutionalisms as well, institutional ableism, institutional sexism, institutional heterosexism, and all of those other examples of social oppression that still belong to our nation, unfortunately, and are being promoted in our nation expansively by the right. So, anyway, that's a long introduction, but and I don't want to really do like a strictly literary, an analytical reading. this poem, but I want to move in and out of why I chose it and some of what it has to say. So this has always been one of my favorite Hughes poems, and I'm not really entirely sure why, but maybe some of the reasons for that can come out of the discussion of the poem. I think one of the things that appeals to me in the poem is, well, I relate it to a number of incidents that I had as a teacher. One instance is that when I began teaching at the college level, I was at Stony Brook, and one of the courses that I first taught was called EGC 101. So it's learning how to write at college level English, and one of the assignments that that was required in teaching that class was students had to write a personal narrative, and I've talked about this a little bit before, but I had studied a bit under David Anton, and Anton was he had formulated a construction that distinguishes between story as a sequences of events that unfold in time, and narrative that is a psychological transformation of an evolving subject. And I've argued in other places that this was always already there in constructs of narrative in terms of character, and you could recognize it more easily if you looked in theater and looked at the distinction between stock characters and flat characters and round characters and characters that that change and transform over the course of the drama. But whatever argument I had with the construction, I clearly was interested in the idea of the psychological subject and how that's represented in literary form, and certainly recognized ways in which if one merely recounted the events of one's day, they were very different than say recounting the death of one's mother or an incident from childhood that bore upon the outcomes of one's life choices and of one's character. So so this distinction I was making in some sense following David Anton's discourse, and in other ways motivated by a belief that the function of a good academic institution was, not only to provide, access to information and knowledge external to oneself, but to provide one with the keys to understand oneself clearly, and that in self-understanding there was a kind of liberation, and that's a very old idea. It's certainly older than Shakespeare. It probably is older than Socrates as well, right? But this idea of being true to one's own self and the truth will set you free, somehow coming together. So that would be the rhyme that we were looking for was, true and free, which is not a rhyme at all. But somehow we, had to make it such. So in this situation, when I was teaching, these forms and examples of how to write, personal narrative, I had a student, and she came to my office hours, and she'd been quiet the entirety of the course up to this point, and it was very difficult, to get her to engage with the content of the writing class. And she was an African student of mine. She had come from Liberia, and I honestly didn't really know much about her before the office hours, because she had been so quiet. And I learned, and I asked her, I said, do you know what you're going to write about in your personal narrative? And she said, yes. And she was very quiet. And she said, yes, I'm going to write about, my experiences. And she started to narrate them to me. And she narrated the experiences of a survivor of the Liberian Civil War. And suddenly I understood her quiet and her reservations and her disengagement from the class entirely differently than I had before. So it wasn't a lack of interest. It wasn't a refusal. It was the it was the psychological trauma of the events surrounding her life that made the weight of what she had to say so difficult to bear and to express. And there was, one could say something in the way, a block. There was something that had to be removed. And before she could go on and do the, quote unquote, regular work, basically she had to write this out. So she had to, express this. And in some ways, like, I became, both writing instructor and therapist. And I never had any qualms or questions about that role. I always, understood that was part of the real work, and qualitatively, like, it was immediately apparent to me that this work was qualitatively more important than the teaching of the formal elements and what that might mean. And so I remember one of my first strategies, it was, I asked her if she could acquire a tape recorder and then just, talk some of the material out. And then we would work with that material. And she would write it out, and I would ask certain questions, and we would go back over it. And it was handled in this way that I made sure that, at every stage, my suggestions weren't about the content, and that they were questions that came out of my wanting to know more, but not attempting to, control what that writing was, because I wanted that writing, to come out of her. And what was, getting in the way was what couldn't be said, right? And so, like, finding a way to speak the unspeakable was part of that process. So I never said go home and write a page tonight, like the instructor says here. The instructor says go home and write a page tonight. Okay, so the first rhyme is there, right? That's the couplet, and it's perfect. Like the first couplet is like perfect syllabically, the rhythm as well, right? Go home and write a page tonight. So we have that. And then we get another couplet, the you and the true, be true to yourself, right? There's no free there, but, and let that page come out of you. So somehow, and it's in a sense the opposite of conceptual poem, but not really, because, one always chooses, if one's really engaged in conceptual writing, one chooses the materials of the world that relate to oneself, just like I chose this poem. This poem isn't entirely external to me that way, right? And the narrative that I just provided is as a part of an explanation of that. Let that page come out of you, and then it'll be true. And so it was different, working with her than it was working with some of my students who would go back to their dorm rooms in Stony Brook and look at their bed and write, something about their bed. And I would try to tell them, well, writing about your bed, unless you can tell me like something that is significant in how that your relationship to this space in which you're living, shapes, who you are, was not the same as my student. I keep wanting to say her name, but I don't want to say her name. Here, her experiences involved, what we would call, the traumas were in excess of what we want to imagine are possible to humanity. And that's what it is to be a survivor. And when we ban and we censor books like Mouse, we're saying that you can't tell your story. If for no other reason, if Mouse inspired one other survivor, in addition, to the story that, Spiegelman inherited from his parents, if it inspired one other survivor or child of a survivor to tell the story, it would be instrumental in the healing. That is so essential to moving on from that particular moment of history and destruction. And it did so much more than that. And, so thinking about my students telling a story and thinking about it, to my knowledge, she never published her personal history. But had she, and had it been banned because it was too sensitive to talk about, to me would have been another horror, a horror on top of the horror that she already suffered, that she cannot speak. Because many of us feel that way, that the things that belong to us at that level of hurt, we are not allowed to speak of. And when we do speak of them, it's our fault that we are speaking, not that we have lived through these things. And that gives rise, I guess, to this question, right, that the student asks, which is, I wonder if it's that simple. So the instructor in this case, this white, professor at, presumably Columbia University, which we learn later, through the course of looking at the details of the poem. But that also belongs to part of my history, because, when I was teaching at Stony Brook, I lived in Astoria, Queens, and I often, would go, to Columbia and do research for the courses that I was teaching. And then later I taught at Barnard College. I taught in the Women's Studies department, and I taught a class on film called Women in Film. And most of the research, I did at the library at Barnard. But if they didn't have a book, I'd go to Columbia and I'd do the research there. And then later I was at Teachers College when I had sort of briefly switched directions and thought that I would be a high school teacher. And so the walk that this 22-year-old African-American student takes to get from Columbia to his room at the Y is very familiar to me, because in particular when I was at Teachers College, I used to take a bus, back from Teachers College through Harlem to get to Astoria, and then it would cross over the bridge, and at that point, I could either take subway, back. It was only a few blocks though, and I would just walk the rest of the way, and I preferred, you could take a subway, the entire way back, but it was a longer route, and I preferred the bus because I don't like being in enclosed. I didn't really like the subway. I didn't like being enclosed in the subway and its lack of light and lack of anything other than the interior of the subway to see outside, and I so much like being outside. And it was nice to go through Harlem and see it's always busy and interesting, and anyway, this was my route, so there's a connection there as well. And so that connection, familiarity with the landscape or the place, appealed to me in the selection of this piece today. But even before that, and I don't believe that I've ever taught this particular poem at the college level. And I certainly didn't teach it in the writing instruction class that in which my Liberian student and I worked to help her narrate what she needed to narrate. But I'm fairly certain that this was part of the curriculum or part of what became my syllabus in when I was doing my student-teacher education at Brooklyn Tech, and we did a unit on the Harlem Renaissance, and it wasn't all poetry, but there was a lot of poetry there, and there was a lot of Langston Hughes included, and I'm fairly certain that this was one of the poems that we did talk about and address, and so there's another context as well that brings this particular piece, home today. So the 22-year-old student, responds on the page that he's asked to write. I wonder if it's that simple. I'm 22. Colored, born in Winston-Salem. All right, so Winston-Salem subtly returns us to this theme of well-being and health, because Winston-Salem is North Carolina's tobacco capital, perhaps the tobacco capital of the United States. And Durham, presumably, okay, he was born there, and then presumably he went to college or spent a little bit of time. He can't have spent too much time, before coming to Columbia. But there's a historically black college in Durham, North Carolina, and Durham is another big tobacco center, and of course tobacco, the industry itself, grows out of the history of slavery. In addition to cotton, tobacco was one of the main products that the institution of slavery manufactured and produced for America and for Europe as well. And so the economic realities of that history persist in this young man's birthplace. And of course the health hazards persist as well. And phenomenon like health phenomenon like asthma is extraordinarily high in African American communities. And I had asthma when I was a young man. I, as they say, grew out of it. But I'm very much aware of how painful it is, how frightening it is for a young person not to be able to breathe, what a toll it takes on one's development. You can't really participate in activities, physical activities, in the same way that others can. You certainly can't do your schoolwork when you're choking for breath, and it's an awesome and terrifying experience, and takes an extraordinary toll on the African American community, and particularly in areas, urban areas, where the history of slavery is all over this piece. So you may have African American urbanization, and the growth of Harlem was largely a result of fleeing the oppressive racial prejudices of the South. So moving from rural areas, that would have been in terms of air quality, relatively healthy, and to moving into these urbanized areas where pollution and other contaminants, took a health toll on the black urban population, and none of that is explicit here, but if you read between the lines, you see the movement, and in some ways this young student at Columbia, his personal history is like an allegorical reflection of the history of the displacement of African Americans, and then what the ramifications of that displacement is in terms of health, right? Okay, so he's at Columbia, and he gives this brief description to the. Now, will his teacher will go home? I'll just call him Mr. Go Home and Write a Page Tonight. Will he get what this means? Like, I don't know. I mean, he's at Columbia, maybe. It depends on, this is his EGC 101, right? And I could have said to my student in EGC 101, well, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't help you with that. I can help you with your writing. I could have said that, but I didn't say that because that's not what the need was, right? And so you in a way, you have to care. Like, in order to even get what it means to be born in Winston-Salem, to have gone to, an all-black college in Durham, and then to have made one's way to Columbia and be the only colored student in the class, that whole narrative, what it means and how it reflects the African American historical experience. To get it at all, one has to care, right? So reading between the lines in a way becomes a matter of what one's empathetic social position is in relationship to this person, this particular individual, and whether one has any affinities or feels any connection between this particular life, this particular movement, this particular historical space. And we don't know, and we don't really know who the instructor is in that way, other than that, he's white, and that the rest of the class that he's teaching is white. So, the steps from the hill lead down into Harlem. We know that already. Through a park. Okay, so that's those are very steep steps. That particular park, right? And it's a very narrow park. And so the descent is dramatic, right? And then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y, the Harlem Branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page. Okay, so if he lives at the Y, this is a tiny space, cramped, and he's very isolated. You get this sense already that he's very isolated. And then one of the things that I'm noticing already is some interesting things are moving along in terms of rhyme or slant rhyme or near rhyme. So you got these perfect couplets that the white instructor writes, and then you seem to lose that, but then it kind of comes back in. So one of the things I like about it is this repetition of the I. So you have this sort of anaphora series of repetitions in the initial 4 lines, and then but you have a subtle suggestion of rhymes in Salem and Harlem again, which is not a rhyme, Harlem, but suggestive of it in the lexical identity of those 2 words, and then apparently nothing else, but you get you again, and who in the next stanza, which is kind of interesting because they pick up on the you and the true in the professor's rhymed couplets in his little stanza, organizing the labor to be done in the activity of the writing. So true is replaced with question, me, who. And then there's an internal rhyme as well. I hear New York too. Okay, so the I hear New York is also a reference to both another Langston Hughes poem, I too sing America, and the Walt Whitman poem that it responds to, and then that's doubled in the in this line as well. Harlem, I hear you. So this question that I was asking about empathy, like, very much belongs to the second stanza. It's not easy to know what's true for you. Okay, so internal rhyme, which picks up on the initial rhyme. You really start to get the rhyme in the second stanza, don't you? It's not easy to know. So first, this is like a narration of the background. This is me. And then it's like, okay, so now I'm going to come back to this question. Is it that simple? It's not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22, my age. Okay. Meaning, it's not easy for me to know either about myself or about, who you are, and whether you're going to get, like, my telling of myself. Because, do you care? Do you have the resources and understanding to read what I'm saying and get it? But I guess what I feel and see and hear, so all of that's really interesting. Harlem, I hear you. Okay, so it's not so much what goes on, at the university that this young man is connecting with, but like his walk back and what happens in Harlem. And there's always a lot going on in Harlem, and there's always something to hear on the street in Harlem, and there's always a theater to go to in Harlem, and there's always a conversation to be had, and to feel and hear, and hear keeps coming back. Feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you, hear me, hear you, hear me, we too, you, me, talk on this page. I hear New York too, me, who. So a lot of internal rhyme, and then almost a proliferation of it, and the repetition of here, 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 right? So the initial rhymes provided by the professor were right and tonight and you and true and right out of, and yet the young man, what he's writing out of is his own hearing, right? And being involved in this, the bustle and the communication and the, in a sense, orality, right? The oral culture and the acoustic culture, one could really exceed in this notion of verbalization to like the acoustic culture of New York and all of its sounds and the sounds of its vehicles, but also the sounds of those in the theaters and the music and everything else. And then returning to the narrative, what's inside rather than what's outside. But I also am all the stuff that I'm hearing and seeing, right? Not just what's inside. So maybe the question, is it really that simple? It's not that simple, because the stuff that I choose to like, the stuff that I choose to eat, the stuff when I choose to sleep, drink, and who I choose to be in love with also define who I am. And that belongs to both my inside and the world that I experience and have found myself in this elaborate network of social life, right? So I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. And that's probably the most important and kept for last, understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present or records, Bessie, Bop, or Bach. So the first two, Bessie Smith and Bebop or Hard Bop, belong to African American musical domain, and then the second, largely, we think of as European, right? Bach, the Baroque German composer, and then you have the alliteration bringing them all together, but the speaker being very conscious of this last element belonging to this white world, right? So these two, if we were like categorizing things into sets, would belong to African American culture, Bessie, Bop, and then Bach somehow falls outside of that. But but doesn't that belong to me too? He questions, right? I guess being colored doesn't make me not like it, So the fact that I'm black doesn't make me not like Bach. Like, I'm allowed that part of what I eat, sleep, drink, and love to be in love with as well, right? So the same things other folks like who are other races. And then a self-conscious, comparison on the part of this subject, like becoming aware of himself as the one African American in this class again, like being different from you guys, right? So will my page be colored? So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white. Well, interesting, right? Okay, so the first fully articulated rhythmic couplet that we see, I think it's the first fully one, right? Because there's been this slant rhyme and this internal line rhyme, but this is the first end line rhyme. And what is it? It's the same rhyme that the professor gave him as an assignment, right? It's right and tonight. But the professor gave it from this point of view of he wasn't talking about positionalities, right? It's just like the assumption that you're this universal subject, like you're the same as me. You belong to this pronoun. You belongs to this disembodied domain in a certain sense, right? And the couplets very much feel like that, like this disembodied domain of these banal couplets, right? Oh yeah, just whoever you are, go out and write tonight. And then this particular young African American subject that has moved from places that embody the history of the institution of slavery in the United States and the institution of segregation in the United States in Durham. This fiber again, we may have to stop. Brings it to very, very embodied positionality here. So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white. But it will be a part of you, instructor. And the rhyme brings that part in, right? It's right there, question mark, and it's right there in the rhyme. It is part of him. You are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American. Okay, so really interesting. So yesterday, when Aaron did his piece, that was in some ways, a take on the way that Rorschach tests are coded, but also, talks about other ways in which we're all coded by the social political forms that testing takes in the United States and pretends not to, right? Pretends to be this abstract couplet of this universal position where in fact it very much is articulating this positionality of it and excluding other positionalities, marginalized positionalities that, either correspond to, one's marginalized sexuality, one's marginalized ability, one's marginalized racial designation, or whatever that may be, right? So like there's this like idea in America that white is the whole, and that if you're something other than white, you're merely a part. And that was also something that came into to Aaron's discourse on the way that these coding systems in Rorschach tests get articulated. Does the subject see itself as a part or see itself as a whole? Do you see the whole or do you see the part? And in tests like this, the ostensible argument is that seeing a whole like is an example of integration, and seeing a part is an example of fragmentation. But it fails to recognize that for many of us, we were already, splintered and fragmented by history and put apart. And not only put apart as the one example of us in the classroom, but also like our histories themselves fragmented. In the case of African Americans, in the time of slavery, literally being separated from one's family, literally being separated from the country of one's nativity, literally being separated from all of the examples of one's own humanity. So say like, write about it, it just come out of yourself, and not to see like all of the obstacles in the way, and all of the ways that it's so difficult to articulate that you're not just from Winston-Salem, you're from the whole history of oppression that belongs to this particular place, right? And the movement that belongs to that place. But a part of you, instructor, you are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. And the radical claim in this is that you too are a part, not a whole. And that being only a part that's what America is. Like, I'm a part of it. Like, whenever Mitch McConnell says, we as Americans don't need that. He's making a blanket statement about like the universality of that particular we, and the underlying assumption is always that it is white and it is a whole, But no, Mitch, you can't speak for all Americans because you're only a part of us. You are not all of us, and that is what. That is what censorship performs, is that if you are only a part, you cannot speak. And that's why my student, felt such a difficulty of being, in being able to speak and being a part of that particular class in the United States, because her experience, in a way, was not, a part of it. It was certainly the very history of Liberia, is a result of the history of slavery in the United States. But to like explain that to a classroom filled with people like this professor who may not even get what it means to come from Winston-Salem is a lot. There's a lot there. Like that's a long history, right? And then to talk about like, well, I too, belong to all of this, but as a part of it, or as something that was fragmented from it. Nor do I often want to be a part of you, but we are. That's true. And again, okay, that's the same rhyme again, right? So again, the rhymes come back to this one. True. So the oo and the ite, and this is what we like to do, when we look at these devices, and not just to say, here's a device, there's another device. Oh, now I know all the devices, but how those devices like are integrated into the themes and content of the poem. And the way that they're doing that is that they come back in when the student is informing the teacher that the black and the white are parts of one another, right? But I was going to say about Aaron's piece, another issue that he addressed yesterday was in these tests, and this is true of the evaluation of the Rorschachs. You identify if the subject taking the test has made a determination about what the objects are like in the image, if the explanation for why refers back to one of the chromatic values, but not if it refers to white or black, right, in the black and white images. So there's a kind of way that these tests say, well, in the instance of these Rorschach blots, white and black are not colors, and become invisible in the way that the instructor's color, right, was invisible in the opening couplets. When the young scholar like writes his response and like writes the word white in, and makes the claim, I am a part of you and you are a part of me, that's America. That's when the device comes back, right? And that's when we see the rhymes around the word white, and also around the word true and you, right, come back. Nor do I often want to be a part of you. So they're both of the rhymes in the couplets come back in precisely at those moments when the student is saying, who am I? Well, I'm part of you, just like you're part of me. And that wasn't the assignment, but it's one could say like a dialectical engagement, with the values that are both hidden in the assignment and that are neglected by the assignment, right? But that's true, as I learned from you, and again, like the proliferation of these rhymes. And then there's the rhyme finally that I wanted, the free and the true. I guess you learned from me, although you're older and white and somewhat more free. And here we find our rhyme for free, right? Because the recognition is like, you have these opportunities that I somehow don't, and why you have those opportunities again is implied by this particular word that exists prior to the final couplet here, right? White. And this is my page for English B, becomes the title of Langston Hughes' piece, but always, right, in reference to the rhyme and somewhat more free. And it's interesting because on one level, and economically and in terms of social economic viability and resources and everything else, this is certainly true. And yet, it's the young student's ability to recognize in his own constraints that are a result of the social configuration. It's his ability to see the constraints and to see the white where it didn't exist in that paired couplet that begins the piece, and to see the history of these places in ways that Winston-Salem isn't apparent to the professor that almost makes this line and somewhat more free his line and not his professor's, meaning that to know, even in the suffering and the suppression and the oppression and what can't be said, there was a sense in which my African survivor, my Liberian survivor of the Civil War, not only was she traumatized by this event, but she was given a knowledge of this event and the depth of her life and the meanings of what it is to experience that. I don't want to romanticize it, but that gave her access to a domain of experience that I certainly didn't have. And in the course of being able to articulate it, I say this without any hesitation, her narrative was much more significant and had much more depth than any of the other personal narratives that I had either received for that class or any other. And that depth and that power and that understanding, in a certain sense, allows a kind of freedom of movement and a kind of ability to go beyond what might be expected by a request for a page, that was merely there to fulfill an assignment for English B.